To begin Unit 4, we're going to pause in our chronological unfolding of American history. Go back and pick up a huge loose end. That loose end, of course, is the story of slavery. Without question, the most unfortunate, most tragic, the saddest story in American history. In fact, it's really too bad we even have to have this as part of our understanding of American civilization. But even though we decided by a constitutional amendment in 1865 to abolish slavery in the United States, its legacy remains. And its legacy very powerful indeed. So we have to take a little time to see what we can find out about this. In order to do that, I want you to understand something else, though. There were, in addition to slavery, many other problems, many other differences that divided the North and the South that would lead us to the Civil War in the middle of the 1860s. And that's kind of where this story is going to take us during the next couple of units. Notice the S on the end of the word difference here. Slavery was not the only problem. During the colonial period, Americans dealt pretty much with the outside world through the ocean. There wasn't a lot of contact between folks in, say, Massachusetts and folks in the Carolinas. When the American Revolution erupted, people from Maine to Georgia saw that there were common problems dealing with the British. And so they got together, they formed the Continental Congress, the Continental Army, and went after the British as one people. But when the revolution ended, it became apparent very quickly, as we'll see, that folks living up north and folks living down south had some very different ideas about a lot of things, but in particular, this question of slavery. Before we get into slavery a bit and try to understand it a bit so that we can move on with our tale, I want to make sure you do have in your mind clearly that it was not the only difference. I'll give you another example. In 1831, the Vice President of the United States, John Calhoun from South Carolina, serving under Andrew Jackson, got up in the Senate one day and said, look, I've resigned as Vice President of the United States, and I'm going to lead my state, South Carolina, out of the Union. But it wasn't over slavery. It was over this business of the tariff. And you say, well, what in the world is that? Well, 30 years before the Civil War, we had a major sectional crisis, not over slavery directly, but over this business of the tariff. I don't want to spend a lot of time dwelling on this, but I wanted to use it as an example of another problem. Now look, a tariff is just a tax. Usually when we say the tariff, we're talking about a tax on imports or exports. Countries rarely tax their exports because that just increases the cost of their products and thus makes them less competitive. But countries will very often tax imports. Now, here's why it became a sectional problem. Look, nobody complained about collecting the tariff when it was to raise revenue or funds to run the government. In fact, Alexander Hamilton, who had established the American financial system, reasoned that since we're a nation of farmers, we'll be shipping our agricultural raw materials out into the world trading system and buying back from abroad things we need like manufactured goods. A good way to raise money to run the government, which he wanted to have a lot of money so it could do more things, would be to tax imports. It's a good tax because who can afford to buy imports? Generally the wealthier folks. So the tariff became the cornerstone of Hamilton's financial program. When Jefferson purchased Louisiana from Napoleon, that's where all that money came from. All that gold sitting in the treasury had come from the collection of the tariff. So nobody complained much about that. Here's where it became a sectional issue in the early years of the 19th century, when the government began to collect the tariff for a second reason, not to raise revenue, but to protect American products, particularly American manufactured products. In the North, the Industrial Revolution was beginning to set in. In other words, folks up north, realizing they were going to make a lot of money being farmers up there in the chilly, rocky climes of New England, began to build factories, textile mills, paper mills, etc. And in order to protect those products from foreign competition, folks in the North began to lobby Congress to put taxes on foreign goods that would compete with Northern products. So by 1830-31, when Calhoun tried to lead his state out of the Union, and by the way, that didn't go anywhere because Jackson threatened to hang that guy, by that time, the North demanding more and more tariffs on more and more products began to be a problem for Southerners because if you're in the South, you're still largely relying on the production of cash crops, like cotton. So, if you need to buy then still virtually everything you don't make for yourself from outside, like manufactured goods from Europe or from the North, you don't care which, and your own government is putting a tax on that stuff, then that simply makes your product worth less. Because you might get $10 for a bale of cotton, but if you can buy less with that $10, then that diminishes the real value of your production. So Southerners were becoming pretty unhappy with these tariff bills. And because the North had more people than the South, increasingly so into the 19th century, these Yankee congressmen were passing these huge tariff bills year after year after year until finally Calhoun snapped and said, "We're done. We're not going to take it anymore. We're going to take our ball and go home." Well, the tariff didn't have the power to break the country apart. Slavery did. Somebody said slavery was the one difference that cried out only for blood. But I wanted to take the time to talk briefly about the tariff so that you did come to understand that slavery was not the only difference between the North and the South. The tariff being another, and many others. Again, we won't take the time to worry too much about the others. Let's begin to talk about this business of slavery. A recent study by National Geographic indicated that there are, in the world today, approximately 31 million slaves. You say, wait a minute, I thought we got rid of this. Well, in the United States, it became illegal by a constitutional amendment, yes, still illegal. But a lot of these slaves live right here in the U.S. because the trafficking of human beings has not stopped. Now that's a sobering thought. So we're going to consider slavery in its historical context because we need to understand it in order to move along in our story of American civilization. But this is a part of the human condition, I guess. Attempts to stamp it out have not been successful. Now to get us started, let's get a basic definition of the term. What do we mean when we say slavery? Sometimes students say, well, that's when you're forced to do something you don't want to do. Or that's when you work without being paid. A lot of people have to do things they don't want to do, and a lot of people work without being paid for their work, but they're not slaves. So we need a more basic, fundamental definition, and here it is. You can take this one to the bank. Slavery means people as property. A slave is a human being owned by another human being, like a chicken, a dog, a horse, a cow, a fence post. Now when you think about that definition, carry it to its extreme. Let's say you got a horse that's all broken down, isn't any good to you anymore, and you can't sell him to anybody. What do you do with him? Well, the euphemism we use these days is, well, we put him down. Think about it. So if a person is property, does it go that far? Answer, yes, it does. To the point of disposing of your property when it's no longer of any value to you. So the impact of this concept ought to be pretty heavy on your heart as you think about it. Next question. Who invented this institution? Well, historians and anthropologists pretty sure that slavery has existed as long as humanity has existed. You decide when humanity began, and we've had slaves ever since, up to and including now. Nobody invented this. Final question we need to consider before we can get into the story in America. What about the so-called race factor? Now, anthropologists would like us to get rid of the word race because it's a construct of the human mind. It helps us understand, however, as we use the term in this context, that in the mind of most Americans, when you think of slavery, you picture in your mind someone who looks something like this. And he might look very different from you if you are descended from Europeans. But because his ancestors were Africans, he has this appearance that places him into that ethnic category. So we'll go ahead and use the term race. So my question remains, has this always been part of slavery? And the answer is no. Until very recently in world history, race had absolutely nothing to do with whether or not you might end up being a slave. Anybody might be a slave. It's a function of power. You're in a position of weakness, you might end up a slave. You're born into the slave family, the slave class, you might end up being a slave. Before we leave this thought behind, though, I want to make sure you get something, because this is very important. Race has always been wrapped up in the notion of slavery in American history. Therefore, when we try to get rid of slavery around the middle of the 19th century, we can do it legally, politically, we can do it all kinds of ways, but we can't quite get it out of people's hearts. Because inasmuch as race became involved in class, if you were not a white person, then you were not in the privileged class, and if you were an African American person, you were part of the slave class. Now, decades and decades can pass, but for a lot of people, that notion didn't go away. We call this racism. Let me underline this concept with a couple of quotations. I'm going to put them on the screen, and you can read along with me if you like. This is a statement made by the Vice President of the Confederate States of America in the 1860s, Alexander H. Stephens. It ought to shock you. Let's read it together. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea from that of equality in the Declaration of Independence. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests, upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. That slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. Now, Stephens made this statement about 150 years ago. It's not that long ago. And a lot of people still think that a person's ethnicity determines his or her rightful place in the class system. Now, let me put another quotation on the wall. And I'm going to cover up who said this until I'm finished with it, until we're finished reading it. Here's a statement someone else made at about the same time. I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say, in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social or political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, While they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior, and I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. That's a pretty good definition of racism. That quotation kind of says it all, doesn't it? You can be opposed to slavery, but still think that race divides people and that the white people ought to be in the superior position to everybody else. Who said this? Another Confederate? President Abraham Lincoln said this in August 1862, just before he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. So, yeah, we'll free the slaves, but they remain inferior. This is racism. So this becomes a very serious and important part of our growing understanding of American civilization. Now, here's a question. Why did the Americans turn and the Europeans, who were setting up the American empire back in the 1600s, 1700s, etc., why did the Europeans turn to Africa almost exclusively for slaves? Well, the answer is really pretty simple. The answer is geography. There's Africa. There is North and South America, continent. There you see Europe at the top. Africa was kind of on the way. The Africans were convenient. They were pretty easy to get. Millions of them living in the equatorial regions of Africa in the tropics, not having moved very rapidly toward the technological place that the Europeans were. And so when the Europeans began to be hungry for labor in their American colonies, here you see on the map from North America well into South America, Africa became the place to go get them. And pretty soon, for various reasons we don't have time to talk about in addition to geography, the Africans became the slave class for the Europeans and their American colonies. I'll show you some more pictures. Here you have an illustration of a bunch of Africans having been taken by slave raiders, being marched down to the sea to be put in ships to be sent to America to be slaves. Now take a look at this picture. You don't see any Europeans in it. In fact, see the guy with the gun over here on the right side of the picture? Another African. The Europeans weren't going into Africa to take the slaves. They were buying these Africans from other Africans. Because Europeans had been trading with these Africans on the west coast of the continent for hundreds of years, buying all kinds of stuff from them. But when the Europeans began to tell the Africans, look, we don't want to buy anything else from you except human beings, these Africans, anxious for European trade goods and the wealth the Europeans provide, were happy to oblige. First they sold their own slaves, then they sold the criminal class, but they couldn't satisfy the insatiable desire of the Europeans for human beings, and so they began to run slave raids into the interior. One historian estimated that over the course of a couple of hundred years, these Africans extracted 20 million of their neighbors and sold them to the Europeans, almost all of them winding up somewhere in the Americas. It's a very ugly story, extraordinarily ugly. Let me show you a color version this time of some African slave raider herding his catch down to the coast to be put on board some ship to be sent off to the Americans for slave labor. Here you see an illustration of these slaves, now that they've arrived at the port city and have been sold to the Europeans, being crammed into the hold of some ship. An English sailor painted this picture of what he saw in the hold of one of these slave ships. I can't begin to imagine the horror of being captured from my home, hauled off, crammed into the hold of some stinking, putrid ship, people seasick, throwing up, human waste, people crying, screaming, women smothering their babies to keep them from having to experience the horror that has come upon them, and then being shipped across the ocean to spend the rest of my life in some kind of hellish bondage, working for somebody else from dawn to dusk, 7 days a week until I drop dead. Hard to conceive of something like this going on in the hands of human beings. It's a story of incredible brutality, incredible evil. I want you to get a little taste of this. We don't have enough time to do it much justice, but we can talk about it a bit. Now, the Africans, when they remembered their journey from freedom into slavery, remembered the ocean voyage as the Middle Passage. All of them remembered it as the most horrible experience that they could possibly ever have had or ever could imagine. Being shipped in squalid, miserable conditions, terrified of what might be waiting at the end of the voyage, and then eventually finding themselves on a plantation somewhere, most of them producing agricultural wealth for their owners. Try to imagine being in the shoes, the bare feet, of one of these poor souls. Now, here's a question. Why would the shippers put slaves onto these ships in such horrible conditions, knowing that many of them would die? One historian estimated that 55% of human beings taken in Africa to be slaves in America never got here. The conditions of the Middle Passage were so horrible. Why would the shippers do that? Why not provide better circumstances for the slaves during the Middle Passage so more of them would survive and in better condition? Why would they do this? Well, the answer are not so difficult when you think about them. First of all, the profitability was enormous. In one example I studied, about 1700, a slaver stopped in the Senegambia country was able to buy 400 human beings from the slave raiders for about $200 in today's money. That's about 50 cents a person. So he bought these 400 people and he crammed them onto his slave ship, which previously had been a molasses runner. Horrible conditions. More than half of them died on the voyage to America. So let's say he got about 200 of the 400 here. If he could get them to the slave market, he'd get $400 a piece for these people. So if 200 survived and he got $400 a piece, that's $80,000. That's a lot of money for a 6 or 7 week enterprise. So the profitability was enormous. Why mourn the death of a few or even many when you're going to make so much money? But wait a minute, you say. If he got another 100 over here, he'd make another big chunk of change. So it still doesn't make a lot of sense. Well, there's more to come. He also understood that it was a lot easier to control these slaves if he kept them below deck in, let's face it, squalid conditions. If he brought them up on deck and he provided them with any kind of reasonable comfort, it was a lot more difficulty, it was a lot more costly, and it made it more likely there was going to be some kind of shipboard rebellion. So conditions below deck, brought on by need to control and brought on because you just didn't want to go to all the trouble to try to save many of them or more of them, helped to bring about the horrors of this Middle Passage. This next one should bother you immensely. The slave runners knew that not all of the slaves they had purchased in Africa were going to be worth much. Some of them had been hurt during the slave raid, some were sick. They weren't going to be worth that much if you could get them to America. So the idea was, let's let the horrible conditions of the voyage kill those weak individuals because they're not going to be worth much to us anyway when we get there. we're going to use the Middle Passage to select out the weak individuals. That's a horrible thought, but it was on their minds. They didn't really care who died because they knew that the weakest were going to die. The strongest would survive, and they would be the ones worth the most money anyway. And finally, we get back to this dirty business of racism. Everyone involved in the enterprise, slave raiders, slave runners, the slave owners, more and more convinced themselves, hey, these aren't really human beings anyway. And if they are human beings, they are certainly inferior human beings. Racism. And so we don't have to feel badly if some get killed, some die during the Middle Passage. We don't have to worry too much about their suffering because we're not killing people. We're just killing these inferior beings, whatever they may be. Racism made it even easier for them to slough off the losses of the Middle Passage. Okay, so you get the slaves over here. What do you want them for? Well, you want them to work for you. You want them to make money for you. And most slave owners wanted the slaves to work out in the fields. They wanted them for agricultural production. That was the whole sort of basis of the what we call new slavery in America, was that these folks would do all of this hard outdoor labor. A few slaves wound up in household jobs, household servants, things like that. But the vast majority of them, field hands. Let me show you a picture that will help underline this. Here's a drawing done that shows you, it was done at the time, that shows you a couple of slaves out chopping and burning stumps. And there's some white overseer there with a big long cane switch to keep them working. Notice these are women. Unlike you may have seen in movies like Gone with the Wind, slave women weren't just house servants. They were also field hands. Gender didn't really matter too much. Everybody's out there working. Everybody's out there producing wealth, male and female. This is an interesting picture. Here you have an actual photograph of slaves harvesting cotton. Notice the overseer on the horse or the mule there in the background. Except for the guy carrying the big bundle and another fellow over by the horse, these are women. These are women out picking cotton. So everybody, both genders, by the time you're a 7, 6, 5-year-old kid and you can work, you're out in the fields from sunup to sundown, chopping cotton, which meant hoeing the weeds, harvesting it, carrying it off to the river port so it can be shipped out. See, begin to understand this. This is a pretty gruesome institution. And once again, lots of blame to go around. Lots of blame to assess for why it existed. But in the end, it's all about money, isn't it? People making money. When people make a lot of money, they're going to find a way to justify that they're making all that kind of money. So by the time we get down into the age of Jackson, we talked about in Unit 3, hundreds of thousands of slaves exist, most of them, almost all of them, in the rural South, and almost all of them involved in the production of agricultural raw materials, things like cotton, sugar, indigo, rice, things like that. And Southerners making unbelievable amount of money off of their slaves producing all this wealth. So it's the old quote from the movies, follow the money. Now, question. On board ship, it was pretty easy to keep control of these folks because you just locked them up below, didn't let them out until you got to your destination. No problem. You're not going to have many shipboard revolts. You don't have to have a lot of armed crewmen keeping an eye on them because there they are. Where are they going to go? But when you get them to America, when you get them to the plantation picking your cotton out here, How do you keep them under control? What are you going to do to keep them from running away? What are you going to do to keep them from chopping the cotton plants instead of the weeds? Big problem. You might have a couple of dozen slaves and only 2 or 3 overseers. So what do you do to keep them in line? You can't chain them up because they can't go out and work in the cotton fields all chained up. So what are you going to do? One thing you can do is this. This is a photograph of a slave named Gordon. The Yankees liberated him in Louisiana during the Civil War in 1863. I don't know much about Gordon, but I can tell you a whole lot from just looking at this picture. One thing I can tell you is Gordon's life had not been very pleasant up to this point. He'd been tortured, brutally whipped, more than once, many times. It also tells you that Gordon was not a good slave, because the people who had owned him had used physical brutality very often to try to keep him under control, thus indicating by the look on his back that he was not an obedient, submissive slave, but instead a bit of a problem. So slave owners resorted to physical brutality. And let me make sure you understand, because sometimes a student will walk away from this discussion with a misimpression. Physical brutality was very common as hair on a dog. When slaves talked about their experience as slaves, we have interviews of old people who were slaves as children on tape. You can go on the internet and listen to these people talk about their experiences. Tape recordings done in the 1930s. And they all remember being physically abused. Some of them worse than others. Some slave owners much more prone to use physical brutality to keep their slaves under control. But I don't think any of them really escaped it. Even the most benevolent masters might have minor and mild forms of physical constraint and brutality to make sure the slaves stayed in line. But look, there are some problems with this method of controlling people. One problem is, take a look at Gordon again. What if you decide to sell Gordon? Well, they're going to put Gordon on a block. It's going to look something like this. And the people who might buy Gordon are going to take a good long look at the guy. They're going to look at his back, and they're going to say, "Oh, a troublemaker, huh? Well, that makes him worth less. I'll pay a whole lot less for this guy because I see evidence that he's a difficult slave." So physical brutality had the disadvantage as a control measure of marking up the slave so that he appeared to have been a problem and thus not as valuable. In addition, how much work do you think the guy who owned Gordon got out of him the next day after he administered one of these beatings? My guess is not very much. Might have laid Gordon up for a long time. So you don't want to debilitate your slave, you don't want to mark him up. So physical brutality had those disadvantages. And how about this? People can get used to pain. People can get used to a lot of pain. Been a lot of studies done on how, for example, POWs endured the brutality inflicted upon them by their guards in places like Vietnam and during World War II, in Japanese prison camps, in concentration camps, the Jews during the Holocaust. People learned to endure physical brutality, learned to put up with it, learned to hypnotize themselves so that it still hurt, but they just didn't care anymore. So, as a method of controlling people, physical brutality had and has its disadvantages. So the slave owners, understanding this, began to turn to more effective psychological techniques. Like what? Well, look, if I can make you afraid of me, I can control you. Well, you say, well, afraid of what? Well, afraid of physical brutality, for one thing. I'm sure when these guys who owned Gordon brutalized him, they did it in front of the other slaves to make sure they said, well, gee, we don't want you to do that to us. But there are other things you can do. Let me show you another picture. Here's a photograph of a slave family, and it happens to be 5 generations of slaves. Now, that was a pretty rare picture because most slaves didn't make it long enough to enjoy being even grandfathers or grandmothers, let alone great and great-great-grandparents. You died pretty young. You started working as a kid. You worked until you virtually dropped dead. The average life expectancy of a slave might be in the early 40s. So you have much chance to be a grandparent. But take a look at this woman with this baby. Look how cute that little kid is. Looks like it might be a girl, who knows. Now, let's say this woman is a bit of a troublemaker. She's smart. She doesn't like being a slave. So she does little things to express her dissatisfaction. Maybe she commits some sabotage around the place. Maybe she makes fun of the slave owner behind his back and causes the other slaves to laugh at him. There are all kinds of things she might do to kind of compensate for her understanding of her low station in life, to try to make it more bearable. Then she has this baby. So one day the slave owner comes up to her and says, hey, listen, you're a bit of a troublemaker. You've even run away a couple of times. Let me tell you, the next time you do one thing, the next time you do one little thing that makes me unhappy, I will take your baby and I will sell your baby and you will never see her again. Or let's say it's a particularly nasty fellow, and he says, I will take your baby by the heels and dash her brains out on a rock. Could the slave owner do this? Answer, yes, because the baby's his property too. Now, if you're this woman, you're going to knuckle down and do what's right, aren't you? You're going to have a very difficult time misbehaving or doing anything that might make this man mad at you, because you don't want to lose your child. And he has the power to take that child away from you, and you would never see it again. So, not only fear of brutality, but also fear of having your family dissolved, of losing the people you love, all kinds of ways to make people afraid. And here was another powerful tool the slave owners had: ignorance. Slave owners found out that the more slaves knew, the more dangerous they were. So if you could keep them ignorant, if you could keep them from knowing very much, it was a lot easier to keep them under control, because you could lie to them, for one thing, and they didn't know the difference. Look, somebody said this a lot better than I can. Let me quote him. He said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Slave owners understood that, and so they worked very hard to keep their slaves in abject ignorance. In fact, into the 19th century, just about every state in the United States that had slavery passed laws making it illegal to teach a slave to read and write. This next one goes hand in glove with ignorance: isolation. What do I mean by this? Well, isolation is a word that means keep people separate. Every plantation, someone once wrote, was a little world in and unto itself. Slave owners found out that if they could convince the slaves that that plantation was like an island, coming from the Latin word isola, thus the word isolation, then the slaves would be nervous about leaving, or be very nervous about doing anything that would cause the slave owner, the plantation owner, to be less benevolent, because he controlled everything in their world. They depended on him for everything. Isolation, another very effective tool in controlling slaves. Let me show you the opening page of a pamphlet that some minister, you see his name there, the Reverend James Ramsey, an essay on the treatment and conversion of African slaves in the British sugar colonies. There's a guy writing a little pamphlet here to help people make their slaves into Christians. Now, I'm sure this good reverend was very sincerely concerned about the souls of these Africans. But why would people print up this pamphlet and pass it around and everybody read this? Not because they were concerned about the souls of their slaves, because they wanted the slaves to become Christians. And here's why. Because if you could get the slaves to believe in the teachings of Jesus, taken out of context, make sure you understand that, because they don't know how to read and write, they can't read his words in the Bible, then you've got them. You say, how could that be? Christianity, what? All right. Jesus said one time, if a man take away from you your coat, give him your cloak also. So if somebody takes something away from you, let him have it and give him even more. So if I take away from you your freedom, give me even more. Don't worry about it. Worldly possessions don't really mean anything, said Jesus, out of context. How about this? If a man compels you to go with him a mile, go with him twain, go with him 2 miles. So if I order you to pick a bale of cotton, pick 2. How about this one? Somebody said, well, Jesus, you've been teaching us to be meek and humble and to forgive and all that. What if somebody hits me? He said, turn the other cheek. And people said, well, what if he hits me again? How many times do I have to keep turning my cheek? And Jesus said, until 70 times 7, which was the Aramaic way of expressing the concept of forever. So the message of Jesus, don't hit back. Don't worry about your worldly goods. Don't worry about your life here, because if you're a good, humble, meek, and submissive person, then you go to heaven. So if you could make your slaves into Christians, you could convince them that they ought to bear up under the vicissitudes, the difficulty of being a slave in this world, so they could pass on into the next, to the land of milk and honey, to glory in the kingdom of Jesus. Now, I don't mean to offend you if you're a Christian. The Judeo-Christian tradition, very beautiful, teaches wonderful things about loving one another and all that sort of thing. But in the hands of the slave owners, these ideas became very powerful tools to convince slaves to be meek and submissive and put up with an awful lot of abuse and to work hard as slaves so they would earn the approval of Jesus and make it to heaven. A misuse of religion. That shouldn't surprise you. People misuse religion all the time to do what they want. We've talked about that a bit in here already. We don't pay a lot of attention to dates in here, but to get us to the next part of this discussion, I'll talk a little bit about the politics of slavery. What's going on in the minds of the leaders of the country as this institution took root, dug deeply into American culture, and as it became a sectional problem, as slavery petered out in the North where it didn't make a lot of economic sense, but where it flourished and got bigger and more powerful in the southern states. Well, in 1787, as you remember, leaders from all across the states that had successfully rebelled against English rule got together to set up a more perfect union. And we ended up with the Constitution at the end of that summer. Early in the discussions about this new government we were going to put together, people wanted to know, well, what do we do about slavery? And some Yankee got up and made a speech about how, look, we ought to get rid of this. It's the world's walking away from slavery. We ought to write into the Constitution that in these new United States, under the Constitution, there will be no slavery and voluntary servitude. Sat down, a Southern guy got up and said, nice speech, Yankee, but if you do that, the Southern states won't join with you in this, and we will have been wasting our time. And so the framers ran into a brick wall on this question. The most adamant abolitionist, or someone who wanted to get rid of slavery, who was very offended by it, and a lot of people were by this time. These were men of the Enlightenment. They could see that slavery was a moral disaster, a moral crime, to the most ardent supporter of slavery understood that politically, in 1787, it wasn't really possible to mess with it, because they want everybody to join this union, slave owners and non-slave owners alike, to keep the country in one piece. Seemed to be some real advantages in that, as we mentioned earlier. And so, as the discussions unfolded, eventually people just came to realize, look, we're not going to be able to do anything with this. And the average educated and aristocratic Southerner there in Philadelphia that summer made it very clear, look, we agree with you Yankees. Slavery is not a good idea, but right now it's necessary. Years later, another politician by the name of Henry Clay would put this label on it. He called it, he was a slave owner, a necessary evil. So, something morally wrong, no question, evil, but temporarily indispensable. So, in 1787 at the Constitution Convention, the average educated and aristocratic Southerner showed himself to be quite apologetic about slavery. Yeah, we admit it's wrong. We can't defend it, but don't ask us to get rid of our slaves because right now we just can't do that. Besides, there was this feeling among many in America at the time that slavery was dying a natural death. There were all kinds of reasons to think that way. Many people were abandoning slavery. George Washington, for one, had announced his opposition to the institution, was gradually freeing all of his slaves. In fact, upon his death in 1799, he had freed almost all of his slaves and freed the rest of them in his will to make sure that his heirs would not keep them as slaves. He really wanted to get rid of this. A lot of people felt that way. It was an indefensible institution. But because of its roots deep into the economy and the social fabric of the South, a lot of people just couldn't see their way at this moment to get rid of it. So look, put this in your head. You can understand it. A necessary evil. Now, it came up a couple of times. In fact, early on, somebody was talking about, well, the world has abolished slavery. We're one of the last countries to hang on to this. We want to put our best foot forward. What do we say in the Constitution about it? Well, somebody said, what about the slave trade? That's a horrible thing. That's the worst part of the whole business. And so the framers decided to write into the Constitution that 20 years after the ratification, they thought that might be 1808, that the United States would cease the importation of slaves, thinking being that at that point, we'd be up and running as a country, we'd be used to working together, maybe slavery will have pretty much petered out anyway, maybe we can take care of the problem then. We call this procrastination. Yeah, the framers decided to procrastinate the question. They even put a date on it. We'll mess with it later, in 1808. Well, they put it on the back shelf and went ahead with the rest of their deliberations. It came up again during the so-called Great Compromise. You may remember, we didn't talk about that in our discussion of it, but you may remember in another context, that the big states wanted representation in the Congress to be based on population so they'd have more power. The small states wanted representation in the Congress to be equal among the states. So to solve that problem, they put together a bicameral Congress, two houses, one house in which each state would have 2 votes, the Senate, and the other house, the House of Representatives, based on population. So they solved the problem that way. Well, after they had decided upon that solution, the Southern guys got up and said, well, hey, when we're figuring how many representatives we get in Congress, can we count our slaves? The Yankees said, no, you can't count them. They don't vote. They're not people. You can't count those people. Southerners said, what are you talking about? Some of my best friends are slaves. And we had this really strange spectacle of the people who owned the slaves arguing for their humanity and the people who didn't own slaves arguing against their humanity. Well, anyway, the end result of it all is they came up with a compromise, the 3/5 compromise. They agreed to allow Southern states to count their slaves, 3/5 of them, for purposes of taxation and representation, the 3/5 compromise. So essentially what the framers did then was to put the slavery issue on the back burner. procrastinated, and compromised over it so they could get the South to agree to join the new government. That's how they dealt with slavery. Now, in retrospect, you can be critical of the framers. Were they cowards? Maybe they should have been more courageous and gone after the problem a little more vigorously when they had the chance, when Southerners were being apologetic. But on the other hand, it's pretty easy to see that if they had done that, the Constitution, barely squeaking by anyhow out in the ratification process, would not have been ratified. They would have accomplished nothing. They were caught in a catch-22 situation. They were damned if they did, damned if they didn't, to put it a different way. Right now, let's go down the road 20 years to see how the procrastination worked out. Let's go down the road to 1808, when the framers thought that they would have waited long enough, and maybe we can now do something about this nasty business. Now, the Constitution said that that year we had to stop importing slaves, and we did. But what about solving the problem in general? Well, it didn't happen. It didn't happen for a lot of reasons. But let me make it clear specifically why not. Pretty easy to understand. By 1808, the same average, educated, well-born, aristocratic, wealthy Southerner who was apologizing for slavery back at the time of the Constitutional Convention was now very defensive about it. He had changed his mind. No longer willing to say that slavery was morally wrong, but temporarily indispensable, a necessary evil, if you will. Now Southerners were very defensive and argued that slavery was a positive good. They had changed their minds. Now they said, like Alexander Stephens said in his message about the Confederacy, look, these people are naturally inferior, they're better off as servants. They used pseudo-scientific evidence to prove their point. They argued for the racial inferiority of Africans. They used the Bible, the Old Testament, full of references to slavery. God tells Moses, it's okay, just don't enslave your own kind. They used little ditties and little poems to try to suggest that slavery was good for everyone. Little children learned in school things like, "'Tis better to be a Christian slave in America than to be a heathen free man in Africa." So the propaganda cranked up that slavery isn't wrong at all, but it's good. It's good for everybody. Good for the slaves, good for the slave owners, even good for you Yankees, who now begin to criticize the institution from your high-minded perspective up in Yankee land. Now, what had happened? Well, it's not so mysterious. At about the same time as the Americans were setting up the Constitution, something was going on in Europe we call the Industrial Revolution. People had decided to go about making stuff in whole different ways, establish what we call the factory system to produce wealth in a much more efficient and much more effulgent manner. We'll talk more about the Industrial Revolution later on when it comes big time to the United States. But in this context, what you need to understand is that in places like England, the heart of the Industrial Revolution, this new system of production, was the textile industry. Yeah, the weaving of cloth. And the Europeans were gangbusters, building textile mills, weaving cloth, becoming better and better at it. And at that particular time, and even today, no one, neither God nor man, had come up with a better fiber for making into cloth than cotton. Here you see a cotton ball. I picked it myself in the South. Great stuff. I mean, look at the duds you're wearing. Look at the sheets you slept on last night. I hope you have sheets. Great stuff. And so cotton became very much more valuable than it had been back at the time when everybody was apologizing over slavery. Well, there's a problem with it, though. Cotton as it existed in nature was a tropical product, tropical crop. Couldn't take frost, couldn't take drought, very difficult to grow in very many places across the American South. Because, contrary to what you might think if you've never been there, the South gets pretty darn cold in the wintertime, just about everywhere. And it can experience long periods of dry weather. So you couldn't really grow this stuff all over the South. Southerners felt really badly about that because they knew that if they could make a whole lot of money. Well, the old saying, the necessity is the mother of invention, is certainly true. About this same time, some botanist was messing around with different strains of cotton, crossbreeding them. And he came up with a strain of cotton, very tough, very virulent strain of cotton we call upland cotton. You could grow this stuff all over the American South. In fact, with irrigation, you can grow it in southern Utah, all across Arizona, New Mexico, etc. But the South, being much better watered by God than that, you could grow this stuff every place, all over the place. From the Gulf Coast all the way up into the Tennessee River Valley, all the way up the Mississippi into southern Missouri country. You can grow cotton every place. So Southerners are anxious to get going on this and to make money, but there's another problem. To help you with this problem, I'll tell you a little story. A fellow had graduated from Yale College about this same time. He was a very smart kid, and he decided before he got settled down into the ordinary routines of life, I want to see a little bit of the world. So he answered an ad to go down to the Savannah River country between Georgia and the Carolinas to be a tutor for a woman's children. Her husband had died. She was busy running her plantation. She didn't have time to teach the kids, so she'd advertised for a tutor. Kid gets on a boat, goes down to the plantation. First day he was there, the woman took him on a tour of the place, and she was walking him around and showing him, here's where we grow our sugar cane, and here's where we grow this and that, and took him over to the cotton patch and showed him the cotton patch. And she said, you know, we can grow this stuff. It grows like crazy here, this upland cotton. And we could make a whole lot of money if we could process it faster. He said, what are you talking about? And she said, well, over in this little building, off they went, and there sitting at a table was a slave. He had a box in front of him and all this cotton stacked around him. And he was in the process of trying to, I can't really show you this without destroying this cotton ball, but he was laboriously trying to pick these little seeds out of there. I can feel it. It's about the size of a pea. And trying to pick those seeds out of there because before you could market the cotton, you had to get those bothersome little seeds out of there. She said it's just too labor intensive to process the cotton. Well, this guy was a bit of a tinkerer, and so he decided there's got to be a way to solve this problem. He retired to the little workshop over here, came out a day or two later with a box. In the top was a hole you dump the cotton in. There's a crank on the side. You crank the crank. The cotton seeds pop out of one side, and pure cotton pours out the front. It was not a very complicated device. Just a couple of drums in there with some slits here, some tines. As you turned the crank, the tines would pull the cotton fiber away from the seeds, which would drop through the slits and out. You can process cotton as fast as you can plant it, as fast as you can pick it. You can process it and make yourself a ton of money. Of course, this was the invention by Eli Whitney of the cotton gin. Now, when I was a kid and first heard the term cotton gin, I thought it was a very dry drink. Actually, Southern slang, engine, the cotton engine, the cotton gin. And so now we can process. In fact, these were such simple devices that just about anybody could make one, and to Eli Whitney's great chagrin, just about anybody did. He later became rich making guns, but he didn't make any money off of his cotton gin invention. So now you can grow cotton all over the South. You can process it as fast as you can grow it and pick it. You got one problem left. Now the South was well watered. Lots of navigable rivers running all over the place. So you could be upriver 300-400 miles and grow cotton and ship it out to the market, no problem. The problem was, how do you get the ship, the boat, the river boat, back up to the river port when you buy your stuff back from Europe or wherever you're getting it from? Well, they tried all kinds of solutions. They tried dragging the boats back up the river with mules. Some guy tried to come up with a river sailboat. None of this worked very well because the rivers run only one way. Well, one day over in France, some fellow was reading the newspaper and he read about an Englishman who had invented an engine fellow called Newcomen, that would boil water and create differentials in air pressure that would drive a piston, and then he was using this power to draw water up out of flooded mines. Well, this Frenchman thought, well, look, if it'll pull water up out of the mine, maybe we can use this to drive a boat. So he got a hold of one of these Newcomen engines, put it on a boat, hooked it up to some paddle wheels, and one day the citizens of Paris were shocked to see a boat floating up the Seine puffing smoke. A guy named Robert Fulton in the United States read about the French guy, got his hands on a Newcomen engine, put it on a boat called the Clermont, very famous event, and one day the citizens of New York were startled to see a boat floating up the Hudson River, puffing smoke. Well, Fulton's other boat, I guess the Half Moon, he built a couple of them. So, with the development of steam power, now, if you're a Southerner, you can grow cotton all over the place. You can process it as fast as you can pick it, and you put it on a steamboat, ship it downriver, turn the boat around, ship your goods back upriver, and you're going to be very, very, very rich. Now do you see why Southerners changed their mind? Because before the development of the Cotton Kingdom, slavery had been valuable, but now it was really, really valuable. Because in the minds of Southerners, agricultural labor meant slave labor. And so in order to make a lot of money off of cotton, you needed a bag of cotton seeds, some land, access to a river port, and a mess of slaves. By the middle of the 19th century, there were 4 million human beings enslaved in the American South, producing unbelievable quantities of wealth, most of it from cotton production. And Southerners with blood in their eye were not going to consider any suggestion that maybe slavery ought to go away.